When I was growing up, if you wanted to fit in, especially with like the zeitgeist, the cultural zeitgeist of the moment, positioning yourself as anti-Christian was an obvious thing to do. And by extension, to identify as pro-Christian or even as an actual Christian yourself, that was a sure way to be met with, well, social rejection. Now, that wouldn't have been universally true, I'm sure, in every place and every time, but certainly where I was growing up, that was absolutely the case. And it also meant that distinguishing yourself as an anti-Christian voice could be a lucrative accessory to like one's career, especially if you were like a performing artist of some kind. Acts like Marilyn Manson, Slayer, Rob Zombie, and plenty of others were able to, I would say, compensate for a lack of innovative musical talent by teasing satanic tendencies in their public image. I distinctly remember a band that I was into as a teenager called Bad Religion, who among like the skate punk genre, which was the subculture I was embedded within, they were one of the few who broke through into the mainstream from time to time. And their logo was, and probably still is, simply a Latin cross with a strike through it, which, like, can you imagine such a sigil taking aim at any other recognizable group in the world? Imagine a Star of David or an Islamic crescent with a strike through it. Any band representing itself in this way would obviously get chased out of any respectable community because it's so obviously an expression of hatred for a recognizable group. But not only can you express that kind of hatred for Christianity, you, in this case, would be celebrated for it. It's a textbook example of Herbert Marcuse's theory of repressive tolerance, which is why I was somewhat mystified recently when someone shared a link to an Instagram page belonging to a black death metal band called Behemoth. Now, I was a bit of a metalhead prior to my conversion to Christianity, so I was familiar with Behemoth, but I was the kind of person who was in it for the music, man. I played guitar myself, and that's the kind of stuff I was into. And Behemoth was the kind of band you listen to less for the quality of the music and more for the associations they had with being scary and evil and, of course, satanic. But when I recently looked at their Instagram page, something was different. They were announcing some new album or something with the usual appropriation of Christian imagery, but instead of being rewarded for this tired formula of ridiculing Christianity and then portraying yourself as satanic and then cash checks, instead it would appear that they were getting cooked in the comments of their posts. In post after post, the most conspicuous comment was, "Christ is King!" exclamation mark, over and over again. And not only was it ubiquitous on their page, but it was also the most liked comment. And I imagine a band like Behemoth, who has been capitalizing on this whole anti-Christian shtick for, well, decades now, they were probably feeling slightly bewildered, like, are we suddenly out of touch with the teenage zeitgeist? Like I said, when I was a teenager or a young man, nobody would stand up for Christianity like this without getting mobbed by other commenters. But here was an unapologetically pro-Christian message that was simultaneously being celebrated by onlookers. So what's going on? What it suggested to me was that there's a cultural shift going on right now, that young men who are the target market for a band like Behemoth have grown disenchanted with pop culture's tendencies to denounce traditional values and Christianity more specifically. Not only were they fed up with it, but they were actually pushing back against it. And statistics seem to back up this anecdotal evidence. For as long as I've been Catholic, so 20 years now, one thing has been obvious to myself and anyone else paying attention, which is that women outnumbered men in the pews. But apparently now that's changing. According to a 2022 study by the think tank Cardis called The Shifting Landscape of Faith in Canada, since 2019 there has been a resurgence in faith in God with young men leading the way. In just 2 years between 2020 and 2022, faith in God jumped for men under 35 from 46% to 56%. And according to a recent Statista survey, when baby boomers and Gen X were surveyed, women outnumbered men in religious representation, but the reverse is true for millennials and Gen Z. And right alongside this demographic shift, I think it's also interesting to note the increasing adversity that men are facing in society today. For example, men far outnumber women in representation in deaths of despair, like suicide or overdoses. Men are 8 times more likely to be incarcerated than women, and more likely to face stiffer sentences for the same crimes. Our entire education system seems to be designed to favor female strengths, as 2/3 of the top performing students in high school are girls, and 2/3 of the bottom performers, or those who are struggling the most, are male. Women are far more likely to acquire a college degree than men, with that gap only growing. 1 in 3 American men without a high school diploma are completely absent from the labor force. They're just not even there. They're not even collecting welfare. And while men, their earning potential has dropped since 1983, women's earning potential has increased by 33%. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. I could go on and on with statistic after statistic. The more you go through the data, the more unavoidable is the conclusion that every possible disadvantage seems to be stacked against boys and men in today's world. And yet, in spite of those adversities, men are also routinely labeled toxic and privileged, and filling up and occupying spaces that should be surrendered to other vulnerable groups. In short, young men are getting the short end of the stick and simultaneously being gaslit in the process. And they aren't oblivious to this fact anymore. And here's the thing about this demographic, young men. When push comes to shove, especially when a situation might become like a little more primitive or desperate, like a crisis or a war, young men are the deciding factor because they are the ones that fight and win wars. They are the ones that will tip the scales in conflict and crisis. And as absurd as it is that this needs to be explained, it's because they are the most physically capable demographic in the world. If distinctions between men and women's athletics are removed, virtually every world record is held by a man. And if you were to put the best male against the best female in the most popular Olympic sports, the male is going to win almost every time. And if he doesn't, it's an exception proving the rule. And if recognizing that fact makes a person sexist, then I'd rather be accused of being sexist than burying my head in the sand in order to convince myself of things that simply aren't true. And it isn't like women don't have notable and admirable strengths of their own. The fact that men and women are different means each has certain strengths and weaknesses that the other doesn't. And in the case of war and conflict, unfortunately for men, they are going to fare better, which is why every civilization throughout human history, men have been the driving force behind military victory and the field of battle, which is why it's a really, really bad and stupid idea for any civilization to treat their young men as second-class disposable citizens. At a certain point, their tolerance for that kind of treatment and even abuse is going to run out, and the consequences will be, at best, they won't help you when you need them the most, or worse, they'll become your adversary and push society in a direction it doesn't want to go, fueled by anger and resentment and vengeance. So the fact that some young men, at least at this point, are taking a positive step and turning to God, that's a really encouraging sign, because all of the strengths that young men possess, if it can be channeled properly, it's a highly valuable asset for society. But if it's channeled poorly, it becomes a massive liability. In simple terms, when men are good, a society will prosper in really important ways. But when men go bad, it's really bad for a society. And in my own personal experience, the teachings of the church are the best way to channel the strengths that lie in masculinity. Because here's the thing, we've all heard a million times before that life isn't fair, right? And no amount of complaining or resentment or envy will offset that fact. In this life, you will see people do evil things and seemingly be rewarded for it, and you will see people play by the rules and be taken advantage of for it. So if this life is all you get, then it sucks. There isn't much actual hope to be accessed. Just pie in the sky optimism and like political slogans that ultimately leave us feeling manipulated. But what if your suffering has a purpose? What if the apparent injustices that you experience will eventually be remedied somehow after, especially in the kind that young men are experiencing today? What if it's an antidote to not only the injustices we experience from others, but to our own broken tendencies? Because while it's easy to recognize how others have wronged us, we also have to admit that we've wronged other people as well. We've all experienced guilt and shame for our own actions, our own shortcomings. And if we're justified for resenting the way that we've been mistreated, then we should also be justified in resenting our own actions as well. And our own suffering can then appear as an antidote and a source of ultimate hope to replace the resentment. Because Just think about this for a second. Imagine a person who goes through their life harming other people, lying, stealing, cheating, manipulating, all to their advantage, and every night they go to sleep without any measure of distress for their behavior, and nothing ever upsets them as they journey through this immoral life. Wouldn't you and I, observing a life like that, think something bad needs to happen to this guy? We intuitively know that negative consequences and suffering are an appropriate consequence for that kind of conduct, right? Well, if we are all honest about our own lives and our own behavior, we would have to admit that we've all betrayed our own standard of morality countless times, probably daily even. I know I have. So our own suffering, if we're being honest, isn't without merit. And Christianity comes along and says that not only is it appropriate, but it's salvific. Jesus says that whoever wants to follow him has to take up his own cross, embrace his own instrument of torture, and be willing to lay down his life, to lose his life, forsake whatever expectations you have in this life, and then you will gain it all and more in the next life. If that isn't true, then hope is an irrational, nonsensical trait. But if that is true, that's the only possible kind of hope we can have. And this is especially true for men. The masculine vocation, according to Christianity, is to be willing to suffer on behalf of others, the way that Jesus did. That's the specific calling of men. Effeminacy is the unwillingness to suffer for some good end. Women, by contrast, are called to obedience as a consequence of the fall, and we see this exemplified in the example of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Men are called to lay down their lives for others, especially their wives, according to the example of Jesus, and this is explicitly taught in Ephesians 5. It's why we can't help but admire men who sacrifice themselves as heroic. Think about the men who stayed on the Titanic, bravely facing a horrific end so that women and children could escape. Think about all the men who have fought and died in the countless wars of history so that others could be spared that horror. If such sacrifices didn't weigh in the balance sheet of eternal life, then our admiration wouldn't make any sense. It would be irrational. They suffered and died without any benefit to themselves. Why would we admire that? But if their sacrifices somehow contribute to balancing the scales of ultimate justice and fulfilling our calling as men, then it makes perfect sense for us to admire them. And of course, we do admire them. All of the great stories we love to tell of heroic self-sacrifice, like in movies like Braveheart and The Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and on, make sense only in that light. There's a reason these stories connect to our deepest understanding of ourselves and the ultimate purpose of our lives. So my hope is that young men today will make the best of a difficult situation, that they will not only continue to turn to faith in God, but turn to the church as well, and that the church will be poised and ready to receive them, which I fear it isn't in the case at the moment. The church has a distinctly effeminate quality at this moment in history. So I would say we need to focus on as much attention on reforming and remedying that fact. And if you're a young man, perhaps consider that a challenge to join us in the effort of reforming the church, in restoring its currently lacking masculine character. Okay, thanks for watching. These videos and this channel are only possible because of viewer support. So if you can spare some help, please consider making a contribution through my website at brianholdsworth.ca, or join my locals community at brianholdsworth.locals.com, where you can interact with myself and other like-minded individuals. We actually just started a monthly Zoom meetup where we're studying some articles of St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa. So if that's interesting to you, then come join us there. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe.